allowed to say anything about why we'd done what we'd done. It was a bit too late. You can't put it in after the conviction. But anyway, so I had to explain about, the fact that we'd gone public and what we thought was the public interest, etc., etc. And in the end, David was sentenced to 6 months in prison. They also took account of the time he'd served in France. And the final, I think, injustice, in a way a greater one because it lasts for longer, was what happened with the media. Because, again, I was sitting in the well of the court watching them take down the judge's final judgment at the end of the case. And he said, this is a man who was called Mr. Justice Moses, but now he's been promoted to a law lord on the back of his case. He said he accepted that Mr. Shaler had done what he'd done in the public interest. Not that that's a defence under law. He accepted there had been no financial motivation in why he'd done it, and he accepted that no lives had ever been put at risk by his disclosures. And the journalists were busy writing this down. So, of course, it was a bit of a shock the next morning to look at the headlines on the newspapers, and they said precisely the opposite. Shaler sells agent lives down the river for money. The government spin doctors, the intelligence spin doctors had really gone to town on this. So a good man's reputation was sullied. So what can we learn from this rather sorry little story? He was finally released from prison in 2003, and I'll pick up on the thread in just a minute. There are a couple of lessons I think I want to pull from that. First of all, that the government's instinct was to cover up on behalf of the spies. It wasn't to investigate allegations of criminality within the spies. Whether it's because of the information held on them or just because they're all part of the same circle, I don't know. But their instinct is to cover up and protect the intelligence agencies. Also, seeing at first hand quite how much the media could be spun and manipulated by the establishment, by the government spin doctors, and by the spies. There are many, many subtle ways they can do it, but they also, in MI6, have a section called Information Operations, which is shortened down to IOPS. And this department is in place to plant fake stories in the media and to spin and massage other stories. But they can also work in more subtly, because what they can do is they can target intelligence and defence journalists and invite them into this sort of charmed secret circle, which of course is very flattering to the journalists. Great, I get to hear some secrets. So what happens is they get briefed about stuff that's going on within the intelligence community, and they write it out and they get some good stories out of it. But then, of course, if they question what the spies tell them, they don't get the briefings anymore. They can't write the stories, they lose their jobs. So it's a bit of a carrot and a stick sort of position for the journalists who get involved in this. There was a very famous journalist who went public about having been an agent of influence last year. There's a guy called David Rose. He writes a lot for things like The Independent and The Guardian. And he said, actually, yes, he had done that. And he sort of got inducted in gradually, where they get tidbits to begin with, and then they get taken on to stronger and stronger stuff. It's a bit like a drug addict, being fed their first dose. Anyway, he got out of it. But yes, agents of influence are a reality within the British media and other medias as well in Western democracies. And also, I think the other lesson from that tale is that we can't rely on the judicial system to uphold basic rights. I mean, at the moment, we're seeing a lot of test cases coming through around the issues like torture. We can't rely on our judges to uphold the law or human rights. And also, I think the final lesson from this case, something I really want you to hold in mind, is the historic fact of false flag terrorism. This is a perfectly standard weapon in the arsenal of spy agencies. As I said, we saw too in our limited time and service. How many more other cases are there out there? I mean, historically, there are many notorious cases anyway, like the CIA and MI6 taking out the democratically elected president of Iran, Mossadegh, in 1953 in order to grab the oil in Iran. We have Operation Northwoods, which many in the 9/11 Truth Movement, of course, are very familiar with, because this was a proposal put to President Kennedy by the heads of the military way back in the early 60s to try and find a pretext for an invasion of Cuba. And one of the ideas was the fact that a drone plane would be shot down and blamed on the Cubans. And then, of course, there could be an invasion of Cuba. But there are many other cases. I mean, in the UK, for example, there was security service involvement in the bombing of 2 pubs in Dublin in the early 1970s, which was blamed on loyalist terrorists, those who, in Northern Ireland, who wished to stay loyal to the UK. And this was done to ensure that the Irish government in the Republic of Ireland didn't give too much leeway to IRA terrorists who took shelter in the Republic of Ireland, that they would actually extradite them for trial in the UK. There was collusion between the security forces and the IRA as well at certain points. And they would sometimes ignore warnings of massive bombings that went ahead. Things like the Omar bombing a few years ago. They knew that was going to happen. There was a whistleblower who's come out and said he warned MI5, and they ignored it. Innocent people died. And of course, there's the Shayla disclosures. There's also, this idea of false flag is endemic. It happens across the planet. How many of you remember the case of Alexander Litvinenko? Yeah, the Russian spy who ironically fled Russia to the UK for safe haven, who was killed with polonium-210. Yeah. He was always rather coyly described as a Russian dissident in the UK press. Nice old-fashioned ring. We know where we are with our dissidents. But he was a whistleblower. And one of the things he'd blown the whistle on was the fact that the modern incarnation of the KGB, which is now called the FSB, had bombed 2 apartment blocks in Moscow in 1999, killing hundreds of people. And they blamed it on the Chechens. So it gave the Russian military the perfect pretext for a whole-scale invasion of Chechnya, which led to an intensely bloody war. And this is what Litvinenko blew the whistle on. And even at the moment, I think there's a case going on in New York where we have an alleged al-Qaeda cell of 4 terrorists on trial. They were planning, apparently, to blow up some synagogues in New York. And it turns out that there was an agent provocateur who gathered them together, organized the acquisition of the guns and the Stinger missile, and basically set these guys up. So even at the moment in the headlines, there's a false flag plan, should we say. This goes on time and time and time again. So please bear that in mind. Just to pick up the thread, I will finish the story very, very shortly. 2003, Shayla is now a free man, and we're 2 whistleblowers with no job, no prospect, no reputation, really. I always said blowing a whistle on the intelligence services is a bit like being a Victorian fallen woman. Once you take that fatal step, there's no going back. So what do? We sat down and we wrote a book called Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers, which was published in my name, and which, of course, I had to submit to MI5 for clearance, otherwise the whole sorry saga would have started again. I would have been put on trial. And we finished that in 2003. And, of course, it deals with all these issues, about accountability of the spies, how they lied to government, etc., etc. And, of course, 2003 is the invasion of Iraq. We have all these, and there's a big debate about this. And there's an even bigger debate in the UK media once a government scientist called Dr. David Kelly went public with allegations that the intelligence case for Iraq had been sexed up. We'd been taken into Iraq on the basis of a lie. David Kelly paid the ultimate price for his whistleblowing. He was found dead in the woods. He went for a walk outside his Oxfordshire home, allegedly having committed suicide, even though many, many doctors say that he couldn't have killed himself the way he was supposed to have done. So there's all this stuff going on, and it's so frustrating. We feel we've got a legitimate contribution to make to these debates, and we can't. I'm waiting for my book to come out. I can't talk about most of this stuff because it's not yet in the public domain and cleared. So at the time, we get very involved in the Stop the War movement in the UK and end up going on a lot of speaking tours around the country, trying to raise awareness, trying to raise support for the movement. And it was at one of those meetings in 2005 when we were approached by a man who said he was an activist within the UK 9/11 truth movement. And he said, well, look what you've blown the whistle on. Have you never wondered about 9/11? And I was like, oh, God, a conspiracy nutter. Go away. Anyway, we went away and we got our first book on the subject. And it's a book that many people in this room will have read, The New Pearl Harbor by Professor David Ray Griffin. And I devoured it in a day. I mean, what a good book. Calm, authoritative, well-researched, no sort of histrionics and speculation. And he just lays it on the line. He says, look, there's all this evidence that contradicts the official account of 9/11. So as I said, I devoured it and just thought, well, something has to be done. And I met up with more of the 9/11 activists in the UK. It was a very nascent movement at that point, and just threw myself into organising, trying to build a campaign across the country, using the experience that I gained from the whistleblowing, dealing with the media, and from the Stop the War campaigning with the speaking tours to try and build up the profile. And David was wonderful at that point as well, because of his reputation, getting some media interviews about this. So the next couple of years, we sort of built it up. And you have to wonder, well, why are so many people around the planet questioning this? And I think many of us feel very motivated to do so because many of the families of the victims and the survivors and the first responders who, of course, have been poisoned because they breathed in the toxic air when they went to try and rescue people because they were lied to about the quality and safety of the air by the Environmental Protection Agency in New York, all these people are still crying out for justice. And I'm sure many of you are aware of the evidence that contradicts the official account, but just for those of you who aren't, there are some key points. Well, there are many, many, many key